Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Rodolfo Stavenhagen on the subject of Indigenous rights. Hello and welcome to a special edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and program officer at the Balsley School of International Affairs. Every week, we're joined by an expert in international affairs, global governance, or some other aspect of global affairs here to the studio at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Today our guest is Rodolfo Stavenhagen. He's a research professor at El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. He is the former assistant director of UNESCO, and he has the distinction of being the very first UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Indigenous peoples. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being on your program, Andrew.
I wonder if we could start by talking about the big global picture. In your mind, what is the state of Indigenous rights globally today in 2014?
Well, generally speaking, I think the rights of Indigenous peoples have made progress over the last few years, at least partially, due to diplomatic activity at the United Nations. We'll come back to that, I think, later in the interview, and also certain kinds of progress made in different countries in the world. But at the same time, there are other countries where there has been less progress and where some of the problems that Indigenous peoples have been carrying along with them for so long are still very much present. And I think that in general, the overall view of the situation of Indigenous peoples in the world is not very favorable. They continue to be marginalized, excluded, they are discriminated against, they are victims of dispossession and despoiling of their resources by outside forces, governments that don't understand them, landowners, cattle ranchers, people who cut down their forests, multinational corporations that destroy their mountains and by mining or oil exploration and things like that. So they have complained, and rightly so, that this is a long history of spoliation, is a long history of victimization, there's a long history of really bearing the brunt of all of these unjust and unequal situations. The statistics are not good in the world. The World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year said very clearly that one of the major problems in the world is the growing gap between rich and poor. Rich and poor peoples, rich and poor countries, and the gap continues to grow. And when we look at the statistics very closely, and these are statistics provided by governments, statistics provided by the UN, by the World Bank and other institutions, we find that most of the indigenous populations are among the lower ranks of this income or wealth distribution ranking of the countries. So most of the poor people, not most of the poor are indigenous, but most of the indigenous people in the world are poor. And they are poor because there is a long history, as I said, of discrimination and marginalization. And now they have organized over the last few decades to redress the balance and have been working in their own countries, have been demanding, claiming restitution, claiming awareness of their situation, and claiming that things be done, policies be changed, and the United Nations has been very active in this.
Right. And just building on that, are there really specific challenges facing Indigenous peoples that are unique to them and where we really haven't had many advances? And I'm thinking of things like the engagement with corporate actors or protecting cultural identity and things like that. And so what are some of the very unique challenges facing this very distinct group of rights bearers?
Indeed, there are very unique challenges that are proper to Indigenous peoples. I would start with some basics. Indigenous peoples have always been close to the earth, to Mother Earth. That is, they have been living on the land, not off the land, but on the land and for the land in a very close relationship that in some places is subsistence agriculture, in other places it is still hunting and food gathering in many places of the world. And this has been broken down because of modernization, because of globalization, because of government policies. And the latest, I think, threat and danger to indigenous people's survival as traditional societies is the interest in their natural resources, which is part of the movement towards globalization. And really, somebody calculates that about 30% of the land that is now sought by multinational corporations for their wealth as resources, mineral resources, oil resources, and things like that, is situated in indigenous territories in the world, even though the number of indigenous peoples is much less than that percentage. So there is an increasing danger to the indigenous peoples through the dispossession of their land resources for other purposes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And how does this relate to questions of, say, cultural identity and the protection of traditional ways of life?
Well, very much so indeed, because of course the policies of states has traditionally been indigenous peoples must be incorporated, must be integrated, must be assimilated. Indigenous peoples must become true citizens of these countries, which means, according to the dominant ideology, that they would have to lose or discard their traditional identity, their languages, their cultures, their ways of life, their relation with the land and the resources, their traditional religions, their traditional knowledge, which is of course a great wealth and a source of information for the world at large, their knowledge of the environment, for example, and you can see that in the Amazon and you can see it in the Arctic region in the north. There is this very close relationship between indigenous peoples and the environment in which they live. But this is falling apart due to policies that are negative to them.
Right. Thank you so much. When we come back for the next section, I'd like to focus our attention on the UN system and specifically what the UN is doing to address some of these challenges. We will be back in a moment with Rodolfo Stavenhagen. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Rodolfo, could you say a little bit about how the UN human rights system is engaging with Indigenous rights issues, and specifically the creation of the Permanent Forum and what its role is, what it hopes to accomplish?
Well, this is a very important issue because we have to go back a couple of decades or longer when the UN opened its door for the first time to the presence of indigenous peoples through the activities of a working group on indigenous populations that was created within the structure of the Commission on Human Rights, which is one of the oldest commissions created back in the 1950s, I think, by the United Nations, and which has been a forum for human rights discussions for a long time. So indigenous peoples got their foot into the door, were able to take part in a long process of presentation of their claims and demands and their knowledge and information about their situation in the UN system within this human rights structure. But that was not enough for a good knowledge of what ails indigenous peoples in the world today, and not enough for allowing them to develop their participation at all levels in the UN. So finally, it was decided in the early years of the present century, I think the year 2001, the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations created another space for them, which is the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which, contrary to the earlier group that continued working, by the way, the working group on indigenous populations, which used to meet in Geneva within the human rights institutions in Geneva, the Permanent Forum began working in the United Nations headquarters in New York, where the social and political affairs were being discussed. And this was the idea to let indigenous participation in the UN open up within the field of social and economic development. That is, of course, one of the issues that brings the UN closer to indigenous peoples and brings the indigenous peoples closer to the UN. So the Permanent Forum was created, and I think its first meeting took place early the last decade in New York. It is made up, it's an expert group, made up of a number of government-appointed experts and a number of indigenous appointed experts. So it is an equally representative, hopefully, of governments and states on the one hand and of indigenous organizations on the other. And it meets once a year for about 2 weeks, I think, at the UN headquarters in New York with an agenda that is developed by the UN Secretariat. There is a special secretariat for the Permanent Forum, and they come and discuss issues of interest that go beyond the strict human rights approach that has been used traditionally in the Geneva setting of the Commission of Human Rights. And they now have developed a certain mechanism for addressing major issues facing indigenous peoples by asking for studies to be carried out or carrying them out themselves on particular issues and then discussing them as they do every 2 years when they come to New York. And these documents are then official United Nations documents with an analysis of the situation, with the recommendations to the UN itself for its policies, recommendations to governments, recommendations to the public at large. For example, some years ago, the chairperson of the Permanent Forum, and I attended some of the meetings as a special rapporteur in the early years when I was special rapporteur for the UN. I prepared a study they asked me to do for the Permanent Forum. But my main task as special rapporteur, we can talk about that a little bit more if you're interested, was not really working for the Permanent Forum, but rather within the human rights setting of the Commission of Human Rights.
Right. Well, and perhaps we can touch on this. As special rapporteur, are there any moments that really stand out for you? You were in that position, of course, for 5 years and
for seven years actually.
Are there any moments, good or bad, that really stand out?
Yes, I mean the whole experience was outstanding in my professional career. It was one of the most exciting periods of my professional career, being able to work closely on these human rights issues of indigenous peoples in an international environment and being able to work closely with indigenous peoples on human rights issues that they presented to me. This was when I was appointed by the Commission of Human Rights. This was the first time, the first rapporteur that they had named. That the mandate was created just a year before, and I was appointed to be the first mandate holder. So it was a new experience for everybody. They didn't exactly know what to do with me. And so I presented a program. My first report to the Human Rights Commission was to present a program of activities, which is what usually special rapporteurs do. They tell the Commission, look, I'd like to do this, that, and the other thing. And it consisted basically of gathering information, because that's what the mandate says, gathering information about the situation of the human rights of indigenous peoples around the world. Now, how does one poor isolated mandate holder go about gathering information about the whole world? Well, he has to count on information provided by different sources, which in my case were basically government reports, secondly, visits to countries, which was a very important part of my mandate during those 7 years, and therefore gathering information directly provided by my meetings with indigenous peoples around the world. Then what they call in the UN parlance communications, letters of complaint, which of course came in and piled up on the desks of the UN personnel, which was assigned to deal about these things with me. And then conversations with academics, with institutions, with government representatives, and all of that was then presented as an annual report on the situation of human rights of indigenous peoples to the Human Rights Commission.
Wow. Thank you very much. For our next section, I'd like to talk about some specific country situations. We will be back in a moment with Rodolfo Stavenhagen. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Rodolfo, I wonder if we might talk about some specific country situations. Which countries are, in your opinion, really taking the issue of Indigenous rights seriously? Which ones still need to do much more?
Well, certainly the situation of indigenous peoples in all countries that I'm familiar with, and particularly those that I visited on official or unofficial missions during my years as a special rapporteur, indigenous peoples all have very serious problems in their countries. Now, in some parts, states are addressing them more immediately, or there are special interests or organizations or departments in the governments that deal with indigenous issues, not always satisfactorily, but at least they acknowledge the existence of these problems and make efforts to improve the situation. And in others, they actually deny that there are any indigenous peoples at all, and so there are no problems. So between these extremes, you know, you find all sorts of situations. My first visit, actually, back in the year 2002, was to a country I had not visited before, the Philippines, because the indigenous organizations in the Philippines were very active in getting me to come. When they found out that I had been appointed rapporteur, they immediately sent a delegation and asked the UN to prepare a visit. And finally, they were able to convince their government to make an official invitation, because obviously, in order for the special rapporteur to be able to visit a country on an official mission, he or she has to obtain an invitation from the government. If this does not occur, and it occurred in some countries that they didn't get an invitation, I wasn't able to make an official visit, an official visit at all. So my interpretation was the situation is so bad that the governments don't want me to come and visit them. And some of the indigenous peoples were saying exactly that. They said, well, they don't want you to come, so how can we get you to come anyway? So this sort of dualism started from the very beginning when I was a rapporteur. You know, my dealing with governments on a very official diplomatic level, after all, a high-level UN official. And actually, I was never a UN official, let me say that. The mandate is a pro bono mandate. You're not, you don't become an official, a paid employee of the United Nations, but you don't represent your government either. So you're a free, independent expert, which is a wonderful feeling in that world of bureaucracy, national bureaucracies and international bureaucracies. You're an independent expert. You're supposed to do what you want to do and have to do, and you're supposed to say what you want to say, whether people like it or don't like it. And that is very important. I think it's something important in the UN system, and usually it has worked fairly well. So my first visit was to the Philippines. And I did have a contact. I had an invitation from the government. I had contact, high-level contact with government officials. My first few days were visiting, government offices and asking for the official statement of what the government was doing for indigenous peoples, which usually sounds very good. They had a law, actually. Very few countries by that time had a law for indigenous peoples. Philippines had carried out this thanks to the activity of the indigenous organizations who were very active in the Philippines. But after the first few days, I visited the country in the company of the organizations who had organized my visit, actually. So it was a good balance. And I found that there were very many problems that they had to deal with. Even though the government said we're doing as much as we can, in fact, situations were not very good in terms of mining corporations, in terms of land issues, in terms of deforestation. As one of the leaders of the organization said, we are victims of development, because there was the idea of the, development is above all a national aim, so indigenous peoples just have to subordinate themselves to the plans of the government. And, indigenous peoples weren't very happy about that. By the way, let me just add, and this is important, I think, for our audience to know, that the head of the indigenous organization who invited me back in the year 2001 to visit the Philippines is now my successor as Special Rapporteur at the UN. Her name is Victoria Tauli, and she has a long history of leadership in indigenous organizations, not only in the Philippines, but also in the Asian countries as a whole. So the Philippines was quite an experience, a first experience. My second one was a visit to Guatemala. They had also insisted, the indigenous organizations, now that we have a special rapporteur in our own language, and actually the government of Guatemala had been, together with my own government, the government of Mexico, had been at the origin of proposing my name. So the government itself said, Rodolfo, come and visit us. And at that time, Guatemala was coming out, or a few years before, they had ended a terrible civil war, a 30-year-old civil war that had created havoc among indigenous populations, and many thousands of victims of violent repression by the army in Guatemala were indigenous peoples. So there was a history of genocide. Genocide was the word we actually used and has been used by the UN regarding the situation in Guatemala. And there was a UN mission already in place in Guatemala to oversee the peace agreements that had been signed in 1996, just 4 years later. By the time I came, indigenous peoples were not happy with what was happening as a result of the peace agreements, because they felt they were not being implemented. And now, 10 years later, or even more, we can say that in fact they have not been implemented, and the violence continues in a country like Guatemala. So these are some of the experiences, first experiences, which I had as Special Rapporteur, and very interesting, very emotional, very really affecting me deeply as a person, because I was living with the indigenous peoples their own sad story of, in the case of Guatemala, genocide, for example, or violence and repression in the Philippines and some other countries as well.
Thank you so much. For our last segment, I'd like to ask you about the Canadian context and then the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We will be back in a moment with Rodolfo Stavenhagen. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Rodolfo, for our last segment, I'd like to start by asking you about the Canadian context. And of course, as you know, and as many of our viewers know, this has been an ongoing challenge for Canada for many, many decades, and of course beyond. What is your assessment of the current attitude towards the advancement of Indigenous rights here in Canada?
I was very happy when I was able to talk to Canadian diplomats at the UN who were very forthcoming and actually wanted me to come and visit Canada on an official mission as soon as possible.
Right.
Because they had been going through a period of negotiation between Canada and Indigenous peoples through treaty rights and recognition of the claims of Indigenous peoples. And some of my contacts with the Assembly of First Nations and other Indigenous chiefs of the First Nations, basically Aboriginal peoples, also the Métis came to talk to me and see me and wanted me to come and take a look at Canada. So actually I did, I don't remember exactly what year, it must have been 2004, 2005, I made my first official mission. But before that, I had received an invitation from Indigenous organizations in Canada, basically in British Columbia, on an unofficial visit.
Right.
And I had visited some Canadian Indigenous areas from British Columbia to Halifax, and several other places, not in my official capacity, but gathering information provided by Indigenous organizations. Then when I came on an official visit, of course, I had the opportunity to talk to the highest level government officials involved in Canada, Indian affairs, and I went on a visit to Nunavut, which had
Right.
recently been, had received or had been established as an autonomous entity or
Right.
territory in Canada. So I found that the Canadian government was really doing some very important things which the Indigenous peoples had been demanding for many, many years. But from what I hear, and still hear from the Indigenous organizations here in Canada, well, it had not been doing enough.
Right.
And that many of the things that we're been talking about, and even treaties that had been signed and agreed to, were not being implemented. And Indigenous peoples are still complaining that the conversations, the positive conversations they had had some years earlier with the government of Canada and with provincial governments, were in a way being blocked or were not being carried out as they should be. Now, I haven't been back officially on an official mission or any other to Canada
Right.
since then, so I don't know exactly what's happening right now. But 2 years after my first mission, we had another visit of mine where the organizations came together and evaluated the result of my first visit to Canada. We had a meeting organized by an organization with the support of the government of Canada called Rights and Democracy, which I think is no longer active at the present time, which is a shame, to evaluate the results. And even 2 years after my mission and my recommendations, things were not going as well as Indigenous peoples would have liked. Other things did improve. For example, the commission which was created for the evaluation or the Truth Commission on
Right.
the situation of residential schools,
That's right.
which was one of the issues that I had mentioned in my report, because Indigenous peoples had asked me to make a point of the situation of the lost generation of people who had been forced into the residential schools.
Right.
So the commission is still at work, has still not done its final report. So things are happening, but there is, I sense a feeling of dissatisfaction among Indigenous organizations, Assembly of First Nations, the other organizations, for example, the movement Idle No More, which has
Right.
recently come up, the Permanent People's Tribunal looking into the operations of Canadian corporations in Latin America, which has met only a few days ago in Montreal and has published its verdict on the situation, shows that that situations are not, in a way, are not improving as fast as we would like to see.
Sure. Shifting gears slightly, we have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is the first comprehensive piece of international law dealing with Indigenous rights issues.
That's right.
Could you say a little bit about some of the challenges involved in implementing the rights that are codified in the Declaration?
It took the UN about 25 years of negotiations, first in the working group of indigenous populations, then within the debates at the General Assembly to get the declaration approved. I think it was a great victory for indigenous peoples, and it raises some very important rights which are now on paper approved by a vast majority of the member states of the United Nations. Unfortunately, as we remember, Canada abstained at the time in 2007, but has declared that it would subscribe to the declaration afterwards. So the declaration raises some very important rights as those of indigenous peoples, not only individual human rights, but collective human rights, the right to autonomy and self-determination as peoples, the right to land, to territory, to language, to identity, to culture, to managing their natural resources, to managing their educational systems. So all of that is in the Declaration. Now, what has happened with the Declaration? It is still, the world over, a piece of paper.
Right.
So the question is how to implement a UN declaration, and that is what I call in one of my last reports to the UN as Special Rapporteur, the implementation gap.
Right.
And the implementation gap is a responsibility for the countries involved, for the governments involved, and not only the United Nations. So that is something that is before us. It has to be carried out in the future.
Great. Rodolfo, thank you so much for being on the show. This was absolutely fascinating, and it was just a pleasure to speak with you today. And thank you to our audience for tuning in for this special edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.
That in general, the overall view of the situation of indigenous peoples in the world is not very favorable. They continue to be marginalized, excluded, they are discriminated against, they are victims of dispossession and despoiling of their resources by outside forces. Governments that don't understand them, landowners, cattle ranchers, people who cut down their forests, multinational corporations that destroy their mountains and by mining or oil exploration and things like that. So they have complained, and rightly so, that this is a long history of spoliation, is a long history of victimization. There's a long history of really bearing the brunt of all of these unjust and unequal situations. The statistics are not good in the world. The World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year said very clearly that one of the major problems in the world is the growing gap between rich and poor.
Right.
Rich and poor peoples, rich and poor countries, and the gap continues to grow. And when we look at the statistics very closely, and these are statistics provided by governments, statistics provided by the UN, by the World Bank and other institutions, we find that most of the indigenous populations are among the lower ranks of this income or wealth distribution ranking of the countries. So most of the poor people, not most of the poor are indigenous, but most of the indigenous people in the world are poor. And they are poor because there is a long history, as I said, of discrimination and marginalization. And now they have organized over the last few decades to redress the...
Director of UNESCO And he has the distinction of being the very first UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Indigenous peoples. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being on your program, Andrew.
I wonder if we could start by talking about the big global picture. In your mind, what is the state of Indigenous rights globally today in 2014?
Well, generally speaking, I think the rights of Indigenous peoples have made progress over the last few years, at least partially, due to diplomatic activity at the United Nations. We'll come back to that, I think, later in the interview, and also certain kinds of progress made in different countries in the world. But at the same time, there are other countries where there has been less progress and where some of the problems that Indigenous peoples have been carrying along with them for so long are still very much present. And I think
today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Rodolfo Stavenhagen on the subject of Indigenous rights. Hello and welcome to a special edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and program officer at the Balsley School of International Affairs. Every week, we're joined by an expert in international affairs, global governance, or some other aspect of global affairs here to the studio at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Today our guest is Rodolfo Stavenhagen. He's a research professor at El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. He is the former assistant
balance and have been working in their own countries, have been demanding, claiming restitution, claiming awareness of their situation, and claiming that things be done, policies be changed, and the United Nations has been very active in this.
Right. And just building on that, are there really specific challenges facing Indigenous peoples that are unique to them and where we really haven't had many advances? And I'm thinking of things like the engagement with corporate actors or protecting cultural identity and things like that. And so what are some of the very unique challenges facing this very distinct group of rights bearers?
Indeed, there are very unique challenges that are proper to Indigenous peoples. I would start with some basics. Indigenous peoples have always been close to the earth, to Mother Earth. That is, they have been living on the land, not off the land.